Hi again. In the previous episode, you heard me champion the cause of protecting wild fish habitat in streams and rehabilitating damaged rivers. The anadromous fish populations in BC depend on freshwater habitat in its rivers and streams, not just on the ocean. That's my hypothesis anyway, and I'm sticking to it unless it's proved false.
I got the boat loaded up down to the lake, ready to go out fishing, and came back up into the car and started hearing some booms. I thought it was the road work. It wasn't. It's a thunderstorm and a sleet storm.
It's very different here compared to a place like the Amazon jungle, where the ecosystem has remained basically unchanged for millions of years. So here we are at Steelhead Central. I was just cruising by when I noticed a giant fish rise and roll over in those lily pads. So I think I'm gonna go fish over there. But just as recently as 15,000 years ago, there was almost nothing living on Van Isle. It was buried under huge sheets of ice. There was ice a kilometer thick over the spot where I'm sitting right now, and over modern cities like Vancouver and Victoria. Trees and salmon and humans arrived here together after the last ice age, in the blink of a geological eye, into a phenomenally productive world of giant forests and giant fish. The Aboriginal people could have easily caught all the salmon and burned down all the forests and trashed the rivers, but they didn't. They maintained that balance they wanted in their ecosystem over thousands of years. In the last episode, you heard me agree with Hopalong Cassidy about the impacts of logging on streams. And you heard me describe how the entire ecosystem of half a continent, along with all of its human societies, got clamped into the corporate vice of the Hudson's Bay Company in order to produce stupid hats for rich people and squeeze out a desperate fraction of profits for a handful of people on the other side of the world. After Canada became a country and BC became a province and beaver hats went out of fashion, the focus of resource extraction shifted from beavers to coal here on Vancouver Island, and then to wild salmon, and then to trees. So I'm going to take up that story again in the 20th century, when the logging industry ruled the coast. It's impossible to understand the salmon resource without understanding the forests that surround the streams that the salmon live in. And in BC, it's impossible to understand the history of forests without understanding the history of logging. At first, the logging rights were sold off in small tracts to the highest bidders. In the 1950s, the government of the day decided to change that policy. Instead of auctioning off tracts of forests to loggers, who'd cut the trees down and sell the logs on the open market, they created tree farm licenses. Huge areas where the finest timber in BC and planet Earth was granted in perpetuity to a handful of private corporate monopolies. These TFL owners would build mills to process the trees, including pulp and paper mills to utilize the lower grade of timber. The eternal monopoly rights would encourage big corporate money to fund construction of the new mills, not to mention fund a considerable amount of hot cash into the pockets of the politicians who were promoting the TFL scheme. All the independent logging companies were suddenly out of business within the new corporate empires of the tree farm licenses. The province's Minister of Forests, H.R. Macmillan, who knew better than anyone else where the finest stands of timber were, immediately quit his job, sold this insider information for financial backing to obtain the best tracts of forest as a TFL for himself and his pals, and went on to create the behemoth Clearcut Logging and Forest Products Company, Macmillan Bloedel Limited. Other TFLs were granted to wealthy corporate patrons of the provincial regime, while some people cried foul, led by opposition leader and independent logger Gordon Gibson, whose nickname was the Bull of the Woods.
right beside the boat.
There was huge outrage from the media and political worlds, and the stench of political payoffs hung thick in the air around Victoria. The ruling party offered up the current Minister of Forests, Robert Somers, as a scapegoat. It was the first time in the history of the British Empire that a sitting cabinet minister was sent to jail for sleaze. But the people who were really responsible, Wacky Bennett and Robert Bonner and H.R. Macmillan, they skated easily out of trouble. Bennett continued on as Premier of BC, and Bonner went on to become chairman of Mac and Blow.
He hit right beside the boat. I mean, I was looking into his eyes as he bit it. Oh, smokes.
Political regimes come and go here, but the same TFL policy continues basically unchanged to this day. The few giant forest companies that remained here on the coast after the TFL handouts of the 1950s
I was looking right into his eyes and watching him bite it.
essentially became state-supported monopolies with cutting rights that were eternal.
That's a big one.
The original TFLs were mostly owned by BC or at least Canadian capital, but by the 1990s they'd been merged, bought out, conglomerated, and swallowed up by hedge fund hyenas and leverage buyouts to the point that they're now just manifestations of international capital.
Oh, well, this is good exercise for your back muscles. My back is feeling better already. A little bit of Shinrun Yoku and a little bit of
The giant TFL holders were now big enough to exert enormous pressure on the government that had created them, especially concerning regulations regarding how and where the logging occurred. They went on a rampage of clear-cutting that peaked around the end of the 20th century, when they started running out of slopes covered in virgin timber, and started receiving negative feedback in the media about their logging practices. The harvesting technology had advanced to the point where it was possible for a handful of loggers to clear-cut an entire mountain or river valley in a few years. It was already obvious that the big clear-cuts were trashing the streams where the salmon returned to spawn and rear, but it was career suicide for anyone in any level of government to discuss regulating the logging or even paying attention to the damage it was creating. The important thing was to get the logs to the mills, just like the important thing in the previous century
perfect release.
was to get the beaver pelts to the Mad Hatters in England. As we stumble through the 21st century, the old-growth logging is winding down, the giant landslides are mostly a thing of the past, and the industry has shifted to intensive short-rotation clear-cutting. But the problems unleashed by past logging have never been addressed, and the modern second-growth logging brings its own set of liabilities for wild fish. It might be a better bargain to sacrifice our wild fish if we got a prosperous, progressive, environmentally responsible industry in return, but BC now has the dubious distinction of being the world's leader in two important categories: fewest jobs produced per number of trees harvested and extinction of wild salmon. The two go hand in hand, and you might add a third category: fewest government jobs required to monitor the environmental degradation our forest industry creates. What kind of bargain is this? Who benefits from this business model? Not the people who live here on Vancouver Island. The TFLs are barely even a part of Canada anymore, any more than the huge salmon feedlots that dominate salmon production along the coast. They're better described as maquiladoras, zones of environmental devastation where wild salmon and so much more are sacrificed to stuff the bank accounts of faceless international capital. The stark reality of the forest industry here on Vancouver Island mocks the political rhetoric about the need to invite big money to come here to fund new mills to create a prosperous, sustainable community. Once the cream old-growth timber was chopped down, the companies that owned the TFLs simply dismantled their mills and shipped them off to other parts of the world, leaving devastated communities like Gold River and Port Alice behind. The communities on the west coast of Van Isle, other than the tourist mecca of Tofino, are in a hopeless position. Their wild salmon have been driven to the brink of extinction. Their chance of developing tourism and recreation around what used to be magnificent lakes and rivers and mountains is crippled when the land base is converted to industrial cropland. The replanted forests are cut down as soon as they grow big enough to make 2x4s and a few chips, and the thousands of tiny trees are loaded onto trucks and hauled long distances across to the east coast of Van Isle, where they get processed in automated mills. Meanwhile, the communities on the west side of the island are left with no fish, no forest jobs, ruined tourism, and little hope of any change. By the end of the 20th century, the slopes of clear-cut Van Isle mountains were sliding off. The rivers below them were blasted and scoured and plugged by flood debris, and wild salmon stocks were in free fall. The giant clear-cuts and huge landslides they unleashed were so ugly that they finally triggered a public backlash against the TFL loggers, which helped topple the provincial regime. The new Clark regime that replaced the one led by the son of Wacky Bennett started making changes. Harvesting policies were put in place that limited the maniac clear-cutting. The new government announced an ambitious new program, Forest Renewal BC, that would attempt to regulate some of the awful logging practices and also try to repair some of the damage caused by previous logging. But the policy of corporate monopoly TFL tenure was not changed. FRBC spent a lot of money. FRBC wasted a lot of money, and they were harshly criticized for it in politics and the media. FRBC also did some hugely important work, stabilizing massive erosion and regulating clear-cutting to prevent the kind of grotesque ecological disasters that BC loggers had become famous for all over the world. Forest Renewal BC spawned an offspring bureaucracy, Fisheries Renewal BC, that in some rare cases actually funded people to go into streams, get their feet wet, and try to rehabilitate damaged fish habitat. It also funded a massive program of assessing and documenting stream habitat conditions and storing some of that data into a GIS that could be used to help make decisions about land use and restoration. At the turn of the new century, I worked for Fisheries Renewal BC both in a cubicle and in gumboots doing stream restoration. Again, Fisheries Renewal BC wasted money at times, and they also did some really good work, in my opinion. In 2001, that provincial regime fell on its sword, and the undead zombie ghouls of the previous Bennett regimes, now operating under a new party name and joined by a new generation of corporate swindlers and bagmen, rose from their crypts and took control of provincial politics once again, dedicated to overturning the policies of the previous regime. Fisheries Renewal BC was the first to go, followed by Forest Renewal BC, followed by the Ministry of Environment itself. I saw the new regime as a declaration of war on wild salmon and trout here on Van Isle, not to mention a war on healthy forests and sustainable timber harvesting and a lot of other things. I thought the wild fish here were in big trouble, but there was still light at the end of the tunnel until 2001. After that, I felt that the big money had shifted their bets against the wild fish, and the point spread had shifted, and The federal and provincial and corporate managers at the highest levels had decided to pull the plug on wild fish, like you disconnect life support to an old sick patient in a hospital bed. The result of the kind of management or lack of management they had in mind for wild fish and forests was automatic. After 2001, I began to think of BC's wild salmon and steelhead in the past tense. I was one of thousands of people who lost their jobs in the process, but I hadn't just lost a job, I'd lost a future doing the kind of work I had gone back to school to get trained for. And I felt that BC was on its way to losing a 10,000-year heritage of wild fish, the biggest reason I'd come here in the first place. I moved to Oregon for the next 10 years. During this time, the remaining staff from the old Ministry of Environment were shifted into a new ministry called the Ministry of Sustainable Corporate Profits or something like that. And I remember reading somewhere that during those years, BC was the only democratically elected state or provincial government in the world that did not have a Ministry of Environment. What an achievement, and a tribute to the dedication of all the shills and stooges involved that they were able to pull it off. Eventually they finally relented and recreated something they called a Ministry of Environment before their regime also fell. But their laissez-faire policies still remained largely in effect with regard to logging and fish habitat in this part of the world. The new policy for the new century was and remains that the logging industry monitors and polices itself here on Van Isle, and it's none of the government's business to get involved. There's no money allotted to pay government staff to get out in the field. So not only is there no more money to fund restoration work in streams, there's no one from the provincial side who even goes out to look at the devastated remains of our famous salmon and steelhead and trout rivers. The federal government abandoned responsibility for in-stream habitat decades ago, if they ever had any with regard to logging. I can remember only one time when a federal fisheries officer actually filed charges against a logging company for habitat damage due to clear cutting. I think it was in the Charlottes, now Haida Gwaii, back in the 1980s. The charges never went out to court because he was fired within a week, as I recall. And that sent a really clear message to anyone else at the federal level who might dream about challenging the loggers. When the provincial Ministry of Environment was blown away in 2001, almost everyone in the provincial government who held a biology degree was either encouraged to retire or fired. Now the government does not need to hire scientists. The new policy is called professional reliance. The logging company hires a biologist, and that biologist reports conditions in the field back to the government. This saves the government money because they never have to leave their cubicles. Of course, the obvious conflict of interest created by this policy and the obvious invitation to sleaze and corruption in favor of the loggers and to the detriment of wild fish is never mentioned. All they talked about was streamlining the bureaucracy. The new approach might be deathly to wild fish, but at least the new policies have spawned some fun new words, coined right here in BC, and now becoming part of the global jargon. Before moving back to Van Isle, I'd never heard of the word biostitute. That is, a biologist who sells his or her soul and reputation and common human decency for cash. And many people nowadays refer to the professional reliance policy as prostitutional reliance, and to the individuals involved as bio-whores or other names that are downright insulting, so I won't even mention them here. But they're not the ones to blame. It's not the loggers biologists that are to blame. It's the lack of jobs for people in government to look after the interests of our common resources. The upshot is that now we have a science-free approach to managing freshwater fish habitat in BC. After 20 years of downsizing ministries and free trade and prostitutional reliance, we have thousands of kilometers of streams here on Van Isle alone that used to be prime salmonid habitat and are now crippled and trashed and forgotten and lost in the shuffle. No one from any level of government ever goes out to check on the quality of the fish habitat. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Who knows? Who cares? No one even knows if the wild fish have gone extinct or not in many of our smaller streams. And the official party line is that what happens in the streams doesn't really matter all that much because it's all about ocean survival and harvesting allocations. And all the main political parties agree that fixing broken streams is not an option. This is the type of mindset that led me to assume in 2001 that wild salmon and steelhead were on the way out the door here. Meanwhile, as both federal and provincial levels of government have abandoned efforts to monitor the impacts of logging on stream habitat and wild fish, there's an ongoing crisis as the wild salmon and trout populations that depend on that habitat disappear. Ever since I moved to BC in 1971, there's been a crisis in salmon stocks. All you ever hear about is how they're going extinct. Meanwhile, salmon populations are at record levels in the Pacific Ocean, particularly from watersheds that have not yet been clear-cut. Humans are crowded along a narrow strip along the east coast of Van Isle, and the rest of this subcontinent is controlled by international capital, and stream habitat is subject to science-free management. There are no positions funded at the provincial or federal level to address the kind of habitat issues I'm talking about in my videos. There's almost no one left in the provincial government who has a biology degree. There's no one at the federal level who ever goes out to even look at the condition of our wasted fish streams. No level of government dares to seriously investigate the long-term impacts of logging policies. It's not just that no level of government is spending money to address fish habitat issues. By now, people have given up hope of serious restoration work and they accept trash streams as a fact of life here. Nowadays, most people on Van Isle never see a wild salmon except on TV. In an age of global surveillance where privacy seems to be vanishing, it's just the opposite along our streams here. Many kilometers of our fish streams on Van Isle never see a human footprint. They're now a corporate industrial wasteland of ruined fish habitat, surrounded by an impassable jungle of flood-tangled second growth and gnarly bush. The TFL holders have always been too big to fail, so the billions of dollars of collateral damage that they cause are simply absorbed by the entire community in order to subsidize the pet loggers who subsidize their pals in government. It was in the interests of the Hudson's Bay Company to prevent or sabotage any attempt to make a profit or even live a humble and decent life outside the control of its absentee owners. Now, 350 years after the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company, our resources are still managed for the purposes of exporting profits to faceless foreign capital, while our ecosystems are sabotaged and opportunities to evolve into a more sustainable and profitable economy are suppressed. Have things really changed that much since the days when it was all about silly hats? As I mentioned previously, I gave up hope for a short-term rebound in wild salmon here after the Campbell regime came to power in 2001.
Great big steelhead just chased right up to the boat.
And I moved to Oregon. One reason was to get a job, and another was because my mother was spending her last years in a retirement home there.
Got him this time.
But another big reason was because I thought of the wild salmon here on Vancouver Island as basically already gone, And I wanted to live and work in a place where watersheds were thought of as something more than industrial scabland.
He's tangled up in the motor. Now he's loose. I think that's a coho.
So I want to close this long and boring episode by mentioning some of my experiences there. The state of Oregon does not subscribe to a philosophy that salmon abundance is independent of freshwater habitat conditions, nor that monitoring changes in stream habitat and repairing habitat damage is a minimal or negligible priority with regard to preserving endangered wild fish stocks, nor that fixing broken streams is not an option. Way back in 1987, the Oregon State Legislature addressed the topic of declining fish stocks and deteriorating fish habitat by creating the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
Look at this coho. It's all full of parasites. Totally covered in those copepods. Its skin is all ripped up.
Among other things, it monitors stream conditions across the state and funds projects to restore and improve habitat for native fish. The money to fund OWEB comes partly through the sale of customized salmon license plates, but mainly the source is the state lottery. Under state law, 7.5% of all lottery revenue is dedicated directly to OWEB. I tried Googling and I came up with a figure of around 30 million US per year as a ballpark figure for OWEB funding in recent years. The state is divided into regional watershed councils. OWEB budget pays the salary for the coordinator of each council. Other members of the councils are either volunteers or employees of other government agencies who attend meetings as part of their jobs. The watershed councils propose restoration projects that are submitted to OWEB for review. Once a year, the OWEB board evaluates all project submissions across the state and then ranks them according to a transparent set of standards. The projects that rank highest are funded until the money runs out. One thing OWEB does is generate public interest and involvement in watersheds. People here on Van Isle know it's useless and hopeless to try to change the mindset of corporate management, so they give up even thinking about it. I know it's useless and hopeless. That's why I make these videos. But if people get involved and work together, they begin to have power, including political power. I lived in Oregon during the same years when the assessment and restoration programs here in BC vaporized and drifted away like fog on a hot summer morning. The same corporate and political forces that nuked large-scale watershed restoration here in BC tried to accomplish the same goal in Oregon during those same years. They tried to snuff out OWEB by diverting their percentage of the lottery money into general revenue instead of into watershed work. A statewide referendum resulted in a shocking, to me, result. Every single county in the state, from the most urban to the most remote, from the most politically liberal to the most conservative, voted in favor of retaining lottery funding for OWEB. Sometimes it comes in handy to have a positive track record and have the local people on your side.
There's one. It's pulling hard. It didn't look that big when it jumped.
The system isn't perfect. There are problems and failures in the OWEB world.
Sitting right off the river mouth here.
The important thing I would like to get across is that OWEB is a functional bureaucracy.
Whoa. Whoa! Holy smokes!
That has remained relatively stable and focused over a span of decades.
I thought it was a 5-pounder. Man, oh man, whatever's on the end of this line feels like it could, maybe it ate the 5-pounder. Probably a big coho, huh?
The funding is dependable, the recipients are accountable. All grant applications are reviewed in a fair and transparent manner.
Yeah, pull your heart out, big boy. They always pull right into the sun.
Not just awarded to the group that holds their hand out first or squawks the loudest when the newest government Save the Salmon project is announced. And there are decades worth of successes and some failures to look back on and use as a reference guide for future expenditures.
Oh, my arm's getting tired already and I haven't even seen them. Pulling right into the sun. Won't go anywhere else.
This builds up a skill set among professionals and volunteers over time, and an optimism among the public that all is not lost.
Oh, there it is. Big coho.
Compare this to BC, where a tidal wave of restoration and assessment funding washed over BC in the 1990s. I lived on the west coast of Vancouver Island at the time the FRBC money arrived, and I remember people joking that it was like FRBC drove into town with pickup trucks loaded full of cash and started shoveling it out into the streets with pitchforks.
No parasites.
This was followed by political backlash that snuffed out the whole concept of restoration and assessment from the political and public conscience for the next 20 years.
Splat.
And the party line from government is that fixing broken streams is not an option. In my opinion, BC would benefit by the creation of a stable bureaucracy dedicated to monitoring and improving watershed health, with stable funding over time, rather than the traditional hodgepodge of temporary programs that come and go with the whims of politicians. But I also believe that BC would be better off with a functional, permanent Ministry of Environment, and nobody pays attention to my opinions about that either. I want to close with the concept of responsibility. Here on Van Isle and along most of the coast of BC, the fish streams run through landscapes dominated by huge corporate timber harvesting corporations. These companies spend a lot of money looking after the health of their trees. Similarly, the owners of the giant salmon feedlot operations in the ocean are dedicated to looking after the health of the fish in their pens, and they spend big money, including lots on drugs and poisons, to promote the health of their corporate fish. But as stewards of our own wild fish, we, the residents and voters and taxpayers who live here, hardly spend anything. When the Campbell regime came to power here in BC, I took it to be a declaration of war on wild fish. Like it or not, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Looking back over the fullness of time, I feel I was pretty much correct in making that call. I was fortunate to find another job in another place where watershed health and wild fish habitat are a public concern, an accepted part of government funding and research. And now that I've moved back to Van Isle, I'd like to point out in my videos that it doesn't have to be this way. Other people do watershed restoration. One thing that stands out is that after another 20 years of abuse, the potential for restoration on our salmon streams is even greater here than it was before. There are new creeks and rivers everywhere desperate for a helping hand. No shortage of opportunity here. Another thing that stands out is that some of the obstacles to stream restoration are getting less formidable. At least it seems that way to me. When I first came to BC, the logging companies ruled the world. They were the crux of the economy. In 1971, every business in Ucluelet depended on Mac and Blow. It was a loggers' town. Logging was by far the biggest employer all along the south coast. You met loggers everywhere you went. Now the forest industry supports an increasingly tiny percentage of the total workforce, and the direction of the industry is to shed more jobs, not create them. You can see how this story ends. The perils of single barbless. But just like the Terminator, I'll be back. So the political clout the industry used to have must be greatly diminished. And eventually even the most dumbed down political electorate must start to wonder if it's a sound investment to subsidize a handful of people who come around only once every 40 years to strip the mountainside bare. The argument that we have to cater to the loggers because they provide most of the jobs here is becoming ridiculous. We're subsidizing profits to foreign hedge funds here, not jobs. In upcoming episodes of the Basstravaganza, I want to focus on in-stream restoration, people actually getting their boots wet and doing physical stuff to help improve wild fish habitat. I'll begin by completing the fourth and final section of my Tale of Two Rivers series. It will be a set of my own suggestions about ways to rehabilitate the trashed out wasteland in the river tributary to Fabulous and to Lake, into a river more similar to the one above N5 Lake. Then I want to make another episode that documents fish habitat damage caused by clearcutting at Cootawis Creek on the west coast of Van Isle, and the successful restoration work that I was involved with there decades ago. Doing all this video editing takes time, and a lot of time in my case, because I'm not very good at it. I've not been able to get out fishing except once so far this year, so I want to send out another cheer to my metal-headed friends at Fabulous and to Lake for giving me the inspiration to persevere. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.